Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Wild Women of Alaska, and it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Samantha Strauss. Samantha, thank you so much for being here today. I absolutely love this topic. Let's dive in.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sunny. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, everyone who's tuning in from wherever in the world you might be listening from. I'm calling in right now from Jackson, Wyoming, which is where I've lived since 2018. But nowadays, I split my time between here and Alaska, which, of course, leads me to want to talk about Alaska. I knew I wanted to talk about some of the female history of Alaska. And then in approaching, as this day came closer, trying to think about which topic I wanted to specifically focus on, what era, the gold rush era really called out to me. And so we're going to get a chance to dive into some of the stories of some of the women that really helped change the trajectory of Alaska history and just American history in general. We'll set some ground rules too for this journey as we go along. Always feel free to type in any questions to Sunny. Like she said, you guys will have an opportunity for me to answer any questions. I will always say that one of my favorite things about my job is that there will never be a day where I can say that I know everything. So, you can throw whatever questions you have at me, and I'm eager to share my knowledge. But I'm very comfortable with the phrase, I don't know. If I don't know something, I'll be freely say that. And I encourage you, ask the tough stuff because, gosh, those questions I don't know, they're what spur me on to continue learning and increase my knowledge of the place. So let's see. So when we're going to talk about the female history of Alaska, and in particular, some specific women's stories. But first, I'll introduce myself a little bit more. So again, my name is Samantha Strauss. If y'all like to come along on Natural Habitat Adventures journeys, you can find me on some trips in particular. I work the Alaska Wildlife Safari trips, Alaska Bear Camp trips, Glacier and Waterton in the summer, and occasionally Yellowstone and Grand Teton. In the winter times, I'm in Jackson full-time leading wolf watching expeditions. So I kind of focus on bears in the summer and wolves in the winter. Now, what drew me to want to talk about Alaska, and in particular the Gold Rush era, is I used to work in the Klondike Gold Rush National Historic Park. I was a Midwestern girl, grew up in Michigan, and I knew that I wanted to travel out west from a very young age. And so, the call of Alaska, I very much heard it, and it brought me up in my college years. And just like some of the women we'll be talking about today, I listened, I went, and I adventured. And where it brought me was the Klondike Gold Rush National Historic Park down in Skagway. This is in southeast Alaska. Now, I used to do trips where I would hike up part of the Trail of Science and then raft them down the river. I also would take young women groups out there and hike the entirety of the Chilkoot Trail, which is part of the national park. It's the most famous trail associated with the Klondike Gold Rush. These are some pictures from those experiences where, it was a very powerful experience getting to do so with groups of just women. Now, speaking of doing adventures with groups of just women, another reason why I wanted to talk about this topic is because Natural Habitat is really trying to emphasize making travel accessible to, anyone that's female identifying and feeling safe and cared for and catered to on those journeys in unfamiliar places. So they've introduced a series called Women in the Wild, which they're expanding across so many different trip types, which will feature, a lot of female leaders, female-only identifying participants, and a couple trips that I'll be leading this upcoming summer that are Women in the Wild trips are a Glacier and Waterton trip, as well as a Natural Habitat Alaska Bear Camp trip. So if you are signed up for a couple of those, we'll maybe see you there. We could talk about these topics more. All right, so one reason to focus on the Klondike Gold Rush as we jump into this topic is that it is a thematic, incredibly important piece of Alaska and just greater American history. From the period of about 1896 to 1899, it drew out about 100,000 people from around the world into the Klondike region of the Yukon. Now, When you think about the story of, these women or the people that came up to the Yukon, often it's the rugged gold miners, the panners, and those a lot of rugged individualistic male types. In fact, when I actually just Googled this topic and just typed in Alaska gold rush, it took me a long time to find any pictures that portrayed women in this gold rush. So I'll just go through because it was a lot of scrolling. There I have a picture of a woman. It's not a historical woman. Okay, and there in like the top left corner, I have the first historical photo of a woman after all of that scrolling. So even though, this is women are not often talked about, they definitely played a very important part in the Klondike Gold Rush history and in the history of gold rushes in Alaska in general. Women made up about 10% of the Yukon population at the height of the Stampede. And in Skagway, Alaska, women made up about 4% or 5% of the population as well. So it was definitely a minority, but the impact that these women had and the power that they held in these towns cannot be underestimated. So first, I'll set the stage a little bit about what was going on right before the Klondike Gold Rush. So in the 1890s, the United States was going through a period of upheaval and economic change. The decade prior to the 1890s had been the decade and the days of Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, Sitting Bull, Geronimo. But by 1889, the Wild West was rapidly shrinking. The U.S. population was had grown about 25% in just those 10 years, and more people than ever were living in urban areas. And by the 1890s, with the age of industrialization in full swing, people were just as likely to work in a factory as they were on a farm. So you saw this social change and also an economic change as well. Because in 1893, the U.S. went through what we call the Panic of 1893. Within that year, over 15,000 businesses closed and unemployment skyrocketed. On average around the country, unemployment was at about 20%, but some other areas around the country hit particularly hard, where Pennsylvania was 25% unemployment, New York was 35% unemployment, and Michigan was 43% unemployment. Now, the United States would remain in this economic depression until gold was discovered in the Yukon in 1896, and the Klondike Gold Rush began, which revived the American economy. Now, with this increase in urban populations that we were seeing at this time, there was a shift in social beliefs, and social roles were changing as well. At that time, for women, for women, marriage and motherhood were still considered to be the most important job of a woman, and it was being in the home. And yet, married women were living very restricted lives. They were expected to cater to the needs of their house, of their husband. If they happened to be a wealthy woman, they may be able to hire someone to care for their home, but that did not mean that they were allowed the opportunity to necessarily pursue other interests. Now, decades leading up to this, many women were wanting this role to change. There was a shift where we saw a lot of women joining the workforce at this time, partially because a single household income could no longer be sufficient during that economic distress of the nation. In 1890, about 3/4 of women in the workforce were single as well, as it was often looked down upon for married women to be in the workforce. And so now we were starting to see women joining the workforce, and we also saw in 1890 the two largest women's suffragette organizations merged to create the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, when the stampede that was the Klondike Gold Rush occurred, women had already spent the last decade striving for independence, but this just allowed an opportunity for the rise of what's called the new woman, a woman who pursued an autonomous life that was independent of traditional marriage and motherhood. One key element of New Woman was that she was not economically dependent on a husband, and she was capable of pursuing an independent career. So with all of that, background of what's happening in the 1890s, suddenly, we have this 1897 proclamation come out from the Seattle Post, which says, "Gold, gold, gold. 68 rich men on the steamer in Portland, stacks of yellow metal. Some have 5,000, many more. And if you bring out 100,000 each." Yeah, there was 68 miners who had come off of the Portland, a ship that had come down from Alaska. At that time, the Klondike Gold Rush was already 11 months old, even though the rest of the country was just hearing about it. And that's because that's the first time those folks had come down with their gold. And so this led to an absolute gold heyday. People were out of work. People didn't have secure incomes. And so suddenly there was a stampede thinking that this was the way to bring yourself up out of poverty. And not just those in poverty felt the call of Alaska at this time. The mayor of Seattle, for example, resigned to organize what would be an ill-fated Klondike mining expedition. There were farmers, bank clerks, teachers, dentists, con men, missionaries, and prostitutes all packed into ships, one and the same, heading north, trying to stake their claims. So through the summers and into the winters of 1897 and 98, hundreds of hopeful gold seekers boarded the ships in Seattle, and they started heading northward with the vision of riches and adventure. Now, let's talk a little bit about what was the onset for this gold rush. So I'm going to bring up actually a quick video here that talks a little bit about one of the first women that we'll speak of. All right, here you go. In 1896, at Rabbit Creek, a group of people made a gold forever. One of those people was Kate was born into a Chad Schultz. Married George Park, a prospector for self-learning. There's a month her brother, and her cousin, Charles Strauss. There are many differing. George Carmack was the only white man in the group registered to claim the claim was thousands of dollars of gold and made their owners rich. News of the major find flowed to reach the outside world, but soon after, thousands flocked to the Klondike to stake their own claim. Kate Carmack was finally inducted into the Canadian Mining Hall of Fame in 2019. Giving her a share of credit for the discovery that started the Klondike Gold Rush. Okay, I'm back. Sunny, let me know if if you can't hear me at all, but otherwise I'll just continue. So Shopflaw, also known as Kate McCormack, was a woman of both Tlingit and Polish descent. She was a Native woman who found herself in the group of four that discovered the first major claim of gold in the Klondike. Now, that's often credited to actually a man called George Washington Carmack, who was Kate's wife, and he was a white American man, the only white American man in the party of four. According to his memoir, Carmack, in search for gold, flipped a coin to decide whether to head upriver or downriver. And then he had a dream from which he concluded he needed to go salmon fishing. And then on August 16th, 1896, just a few miles from the junction of the Klondike and the Yukon Rivers, on a creek that was later named Bonanza, Carmack found gold. Now, in his memoir, this man, Carmack, he fails to mention his first wife, Kate, at all, even though she was there on this expedition. And there are a lot of assertions that all of Carmack's claims should be taken with a grain of salt, because even as he nods to in his memoir, he is often referred to as Lying George amongst those people at the time. Now, there's another prominent theory about who it was that discovered gold. The Sourdough Stampede Association, historians that focus on this region, they put forth another scenario where Kate Carmack is the true discoverer. They say while Carmack was resting, his wife, in wandering around, found a bit of bedrock exposed and taking a pan of dirt, washed it, and found that she had some $4 in coarse gold. Unfortunately for Kate, being a married woman prevented her from being able to file as a claim owner, thus leaving no official documentation of her participation in this gold finding. Married women at the time were expected to file claims under their husband's name, And so, although we'll never know if it was a woman, if Chautauqua was the one who started the entire gold rush, I do think this scenario hints at the fact that women are often largely forgotten in this role of making the Klondike the place it is. Now let's dive in a little bit into what this looks like, just some context of the if you wanted to go to the Klondike, all right, time travel with me. We're back in 1897. We've just heard that there's gold. All of us are rearing to get up north to stake our claim. What you're going to do is you're going to take a ship from Seattle or Portland. You're going to travel up along the coast, and you're going to, most prominently, you're going to end up in Skagway. Skagway would then lead to a place called Dyea overland. This is a picture of what Skagway looked like at the time. Definitely rough and tumble. This is where I lived for a couple of years. I got to say, they've kept a lot of the boardwalks there, a lot of the saloons there as well. You can visit the Red Onion, a historic brothel there too. It's part of the national park. So you travel to Skagway, and then you head on over to Dyea. Most would take the Chilkoot Pass or the White Pass. These are two passes that were overland, which would then lead you to Bennett Lake eventually. At Bennett Lake, you would build a boat, and you would eventually end up traveling upriver up to get to the Klondike at Dawson City. This is Dawson City here. There were a couple other trails that were entirely overland, but they just were less prominent. I'll particularly be focusing on the Chilkoot Trail and some of what I'm talking about, because the Chilkoot's where I used to guide on, and it has a lot of the history, and most of the miners came through that area. Now, when talking about going on the Chilkoot Trail, so the Chilkoot Trail is only 33 miles long. It's not that far, really. However, it is a gnarly 33 miles. It's tough because pack animals can't be used on the steep slopes leading up the pass. Later, tramways were built in the late 1897, early 1998. But until then, everyone had to carry everything on their backs. And even after the tramways were built, it was still economically not viable for most. During that first gold rush, there was the first year of the gold rush, there was an estimated 20 to 30,000 prospectors that spent an average of 3 months packing their outfits up and over the trails and over the passes to the lake. Now, how could that possibly be? Why would it take so long? I'll get into that in a second here, but this is an example, this picture of what's called the Golden Staircase. This is about a half a mile from point A to point B, in which it goes up over 1,000 feet elevation. There's about 1,500 steps that you have to make as a miner to get all the way to the top. This is some pictures of me leading a group of women over the Golden Staircase. I will say it is a lot scarier person than it looks in pictures, that's for sure. And this is also in summertime, but there's still snow. Another way that people would potentially, if you had money that you could have your goods packed over, would be to hire native packers. Both female and male native packers found work this way. However, it wasn't accessible unless you were often quite wealthy. It's very expensive. Now, the reason why it took so long to get over the trail was that you had to carry a lot of stuff with you. Now, the Mounties, those folks that were, at the border of the Yukon, which, by the way, the Canadian border was right at the top of the Golden Staircase, just really a little bit past it, where you end up about half the trails in the U.S., half of it's in Canada. You'd have to pass over, and you'd have to go through the Canadian government to be able to get through. Now, the Mounties required that every stampeder bring a year's supply of goods before crossing the border. Now, at this time, not many people heading to the Klondike had any idea of what they were getting themselves into. They'd never been to Alaska, never been to the Yukon. They were just fueled by dreams of gold and ambition, setting sail on this adventure and not necessarily properly preparing for it. Now, the Canadian government required that everyone have at least 3 pounds of food per day for a whole year. That's just the food, which would weigh over half a ton. And then with all the other supplies, it would end up weighing over 2,000 pounds, the total required goods. So just some favorites I'll pick out from here: 150 pounds of bacon. You'd have to have 200 feet of rope. You'd have to have tents, overshirts, 5 yards of mosquito netting for each man. Obviously, 2,000 pounds of goods, that's quite a bit. But that was just for the men. For the women who were attempting to do this trail, it was an entirely different challenges that they had to face. Now, in the 1890s, the state of fashion at the time was that it was the late Victorian era. Women were still expected to have the bloomers, the petticoats. They were expected to have corsets and high neck collars. The puffy sleeves were in fashion, very heavy garments. And what was in fashion was the bigger and more obstructive the dresses, the tighter the corset, the more that implied that this was not, that you were not a working woman and therefore were a member of the higher class. And so women were, just societally incentivized to wear garments that made it really difficult for them to work. Now, as we talked about, though, at this era, more and more women were joining the workforce. And so we found there started to be a shift in fashion. However, I will say it was not as dramatic as a shift in fashion that one would hope. Women were still wearing garments really similar to what we're looking at on screen here when they were making their way up and over the trail. It was illegal at the time for women to wear pants on the Chilkoot Trail. Again, I'm just so happy having done the trail multiple times that we progressed past that. They did not have the option of, Patagonia rain jackets or nice REI hiking boots. Instead, they were wearing high lace-up, high-toed shoes or high-heeled shoes. And there were other necessary pieces that they had to bring as well. Now, this woman, Annie Hall Strong, I'll talk about, because she was the one who really encouraged women to come on up and to be prepared. So Annie Strong, she wrote articles in the local Skagway newspaper that were titled "Advice to Women." And the reason why she did this was because she said, despite the fact that men at the time were saying, please, women shouldn't, this is no place for women, she said, quote, "There is no use trying to discourage them. Our wills are strong and courage unfailing. There are a few things a woman should carefully consider before starting out on this really perilous journey. Delicate women have no right attempting the trip. It means utter collapse. Those who love luxury, comfort, and ease would better remain at home. It takes strong, healthy, courageous women to stand the terrible hardships that must necessarily be endured." And so, if you were a strong, courageous, enduring woman brought up here, not only would you have to adhere to that 2,000 pounds of goods required by the Mounties, but you would also probably be working from this list that Annie Hall would advertise throughout the nation. This is, so many different pairs of stockings, of slippers. She very much liked her footwear. We have a waist and bloomers, Arctic hoods, aprons, shirtwaists, undervests, summer suits and winter suits. And also bedding, because one of the roles that women were expected to upkeep on the trail was, you'd often be accompanied by a male, whether that was a relative or by a husband. And you would be expected to also somehow maintain the homekeeper status that women were meant to, or were given and held on to in the back in the lower 48. And so you were expected to somehow keep the sense of propriety and keep a home for others and help make others feel more comfortable. And so they'd also be expected to bring bedding. Annie did say that she said, an old miner would no doubt laugh me to scorn me for suggesting a little satchel or handbag, but the comforts derived from the 101 little extras a woman can deftly stow away in it will doubly repay the bother of carrying it. So maybe you'd want to have a handbag as well. Now, this picture here shows what women tended to, those that attempted to mine, what they actually chose to wear most of the time, which was sort of a pared down version of that uniform expected of them. Some women, like Klondike Kate, who we'll talk about in a little bit, also would be tried to wear pants, in order to pass themselves off as a man during certain points of the journey. Now, when we talk about miners, I want to bring up Nellie Cashman because she was a career miner. She was a woman who had been involved in multiple gold rushes of the past. She was an immigrant from Ireland. She was born in County Cork. And after that disastrous Irish potato famine, the Cashmans joined the Great Migration out of Ireland and into the United States. She eventually settled in Boston and then, made her way throughout different silver and gold rush boom towns, and Tombstone, Arizona, specifically, is one prominent place she spent a lot of time. She eventually made her way up to Alaska, where she staked claims all throughout the Klondike. She was known throughout the mining camps as an amazing woman, and throughout all this time, she remained unmarried, which was a risky thing for women at the time, both financially as well as safety-wise, to not have the protection of a man with you. But she was a great example of holding out for oneself. And she would continue to make strides as far as women empowerment goes, because in 1912 she also became the first woman to cast a vote in Alaska. This was in the decision to formally make Alaska a territory of the United States. At that time, women were not allowed to legally vote, and she didn't really know. The history questions whether she knew that she couldn't vote or not, but regardless, she voted, and she, not only set the example of the fact that women could mine and have mined successfully and made a living for themselves doing so in these gold rushes, but she also, set a point in women's suffrage advancement. This is her later in life. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the business women of Alaska as well. So this right here is Bessie Couture. Now, just to talk a little bit about business in Alaska at the time, when we think about these gold rushes, we often think of the people who were actually mining and panning that gold as those that made their fortunes. To be honest, that is a very small percentage of folks who made it rich during the gold rushes. In fact, it wasn't the miners that made most of the money. It was the people that mined the miners, the business folks, those that were able to feed, clothe, house those, ambitious miners on their journeys. And Bessie Couture was a great example of that. One reason why I really love talking about this period of time, too, is because Alaska, unlike the lower 48, Alaska was an area that, in the Klondike in particular, where some of the social norms did not as heavily apply. This came to, different prejudices and roles that Black women could or could not fill in society at the time. Alaska as a place where, there was still a lot of, I should say, Skagway and Dawson City as places that really were just booming without any type of, organization or governance in the beginning. There was a room for people to take on roles and identities that might have been taboo elsewhere in society. And that's what Bessie Couture thought. She was a woman who looked beyond traditional roles. She had an entrepreneurial spirit. She definitely sought out for a better life for herself. And so she wanted more than what the lower 48 offered her, which was that most of the African-American women were restricted primarily to jobs in domestic service. She had other plans, though. She came up to Skagway, and she soon started and operated two different restaurants there. One restaurant called The Kitchen, and the other called the Black and White Restaurant. She was known as the first Black business owner in Alaska. And despite this achievement, unfortunately, we don't know much about her, beyond the fact she was married 3 times, and she was listed as the head of household and of owning her own home. This was an achievement for a woman at this time, and it was also the biggest part of that was that owning her own home as an African-American woman was almost unheard of at that time. So Bessie Couture was a great example of how the Klondike offered opportunities for women of, minority identities to come and stake a claim to themselves and find freedoms, or carve out freedoms that they would not have been able to find for themselves elsewhere. Now, I'll move on to another businesswoman called Harriet Pullen, also known as Ma Pullen. I love her story because I think about, her early times getting over into Dawson City and going up and over the Chilkoot Trail. So Ma Pullen was one second, let me just move over here. So Ma Pullen was a woman who, when she first arrived, had only $7 to her name. She didn't know a soul in Alaska. She had no place to go. She stood on the beach in the rain while tenting in Skagway of 1897 shouted, cursed, and surged about me. She would go on to open up the Pullen House, a absolutely elaborate and what's considered to be the nicest house in Skagway, Alaska. She would stay there for the rest of her life, and it was another great example of a woman really carving out a piece of history for herself and finding an opportunity for entrepreneurial spirit to thrive. Now, one story of this experience for Ma Poland was that she, when she opened up I'm sorry, let me back up here. You know, I'm actually gonna talk about somebody that I don't have a picture of here, I'm realizing, but who is definitely worth mentioning. So there was a woman named Belinda Mulrooney, who's known as the richest woman of the Klondike. She was a coal miner's daughter from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and she'd already developed a very sharp business sense at that time. She'd earned several $1,000s operating a sandwich stand at the Chicago World's Fair. She put all of those savings in an ice cream parlor in San Francisco, but then lost everything when it was destroyed by a fire. She eventually took a job as a stewardess, and she traded hats and dresses, and she ended up saving $5,000 by the time some news of the gold discovery in the Klondike reached California. She ended up spending it all on some treasures that she put into a trunk. Now, she and her goods, along with the rest of her party, went up and over the Chilkoot Trail to Dawson City. And what that looks like for people, too, was you couldn't necessarily just go up with 2,000 pounds of goods plus and then all in one go. You'd go there and back, there and back, there and back, with one member of your party staying behind with your goods. For her, you know, or for most people, it would end up being often over 1,000-mile journey just to get to Bennett Lake, just from going back and forth so many times. Well, during all those back and forth trips, Rooney would not actually let go of her one trunk of treasures that she'd invested into. One second, let me adjust my mic here. I think it might be losing power, so let me know if that happens. Okay, I think I've adjusted my mic to help it get better power. Okay, so Belinda Mulrooney, she would take this trunk over with her, and every time she would go over the Chilkoot Trail, bringing more supplies, she'd have this trunk with her. People started to wonder, what is it that she has in her trunk? You know, by the time she actually reaches Dawson City at the very far end of the trail where the Klondike's at, finally she opened up her trunk. Now, what is it that she invested all of those $5,000 into? What could a savvy businesswoman have thought would have been a good payout by the time she gets there? It's not money, or it's not gold. Obviously, there's gold there. It's not food. Instead, it was a variety of things. It was hot water bottles, bolts of fabric, but in particular, it was a lot of the latest French fashions of underwear, because Belinda Mulrooney realized, or when she was thinking about it, she's like, who is bound to have money by the time I reach the end of that trail? Who will my clientele be? Well, she was smart enough to know that whole adage of it's the people who mind the miners that have the cash. And in particular, she realized that there would be a lot of women working in the sex trade in Dawson City. Now, that was made up about half of the working women in Dawson City were women who worked within the sex trade or within dance halls. Now, Belinda Mulrooney, smart woman, she realized, okay, these are going to be the women who have all the gold. And so she sold them, these latest lingerie fashions. She made enough money to start her own restaurant. And she ended up, it ended up being the treasure restaurant of Dawson City. Now, she was a woman who, like I said, had gone through some ups and downs. She ended up marrying a man who called himself a count, and ended up only being a barber who stole all of her money. But she made it back again just through her shrewd business sense. Another up and down that she went through was she once partnered with a fellow Klondike legend, Alex McDonald, to salvage the cargo from a small ship that was wrecked on a sandbar. Now, McDonald got there first, and he took all of the food, leaving only gumboots and whiskey for her. She later got her revenge, though, and the next spring, when McDonald's needed boots for his workers, he had to pay her $100 a pair. So great example of just a very shrewd, business savvy woman who who was able to anticipate the desires and needs of those who would have money on the trail. Now let's talk a little bit about the dance halls of the time. So often, when we talk about women of the Klondike, women of the Gold Rush, it often ends up stereotyped into just dance hall girls. And I say just, without, but we should definitely not be thinking just dance hall girls. As we've seen, there's other roles that women played. They were miners themselves. They were business owners. And the role of a dance hall girl was anything but a simple thing to be. This right here is Kate Kitty Rockwell, also known as Klondike Kate or the Queen of the Klondike. One sort of tongue-in-cheek quote that she said was, "We wore tights in those days because if we hadn't, the mounted police would have run us out of the country." Now, the Klondike, along with offering opportunities for women of different societal classes, different races, different standings in life, to have opportunity. It also offered opportunity for women who weren't traditionally what was expected, as far as beauty and goes at the time. One major difference between the Klondike dancers and their counterparts in the continental U.S. is that the girls who would not have necessarily made it as entertainment and as successful entertainers elsewhere, but were able to in the Yukon. They maybe had body types that didn't conform to the standards at the time. They maybe weren't that great of dancers, but gosh, they made it all the way to Dawson City, which meant that they were going to be in high demand. Now, this was a tough way to live, even though it did earn a lot of money. One example is Monte Carlo in Dawson City, which is a place where Kitty or Klondike Kate worked. The girls were expected to work 12-hour shifts 6 nights a week. They had no break in those 12 hours because they were expected to entertain the men in between performances. They were also had, beyond those 12 hours, they had conditioning workouts in the gym each day, rehearsals. They had to memorize lines and lyrics, write skits, playlists, and song lyrics, and design and make or buy their own costumes. So you can imagine they were not getting much sleep at the time. And yet the pay for these dance hall girls, what they received each night, was more than what most women could make in a month in another potentially more respectable job. Now, one thing that these women often did was have names that gave them a sense of anonymity. It's hard to trace some of the women that were prominent dancers at this time because they lost those names or discarded them as they went down into, get married or start other careers elsewhere. But some of the names that I think are particularly fun include Diamond Tooth Skirty, Nellie the Pig, Ping Pong, Diamond Lil, Caprice, Grizzly Bear, Oregon Mare, Gumboot Sue, and Montreal Marie. You can just think, if you would have been a dance hall girl back in the day, what would your name have been? Now, these women were enchanting to a lot of these men who, either were unmarried or had left partners behind back in the lower 48. These men would be willing to do whatever they could to get these women's attention. And what they had was gold. One hopeful miner offered a dancer, Cecile Marian, her weight in gold if she would marry him. She weighed 135 pounds, and that equaled about $25,000 worth of gold at the time. Now, another example is that one dancer, Tad Wilson, was given a belt of gold nuggets that were worth $50,000, made to her by several of her admirers, while another man had a bath filled with wine for her ready any night that she wanted. This Klondike Kate, she earned about $200 a night with her famous flame dance. She's also the woman who would dress up in boys' clothes to try to trick the Mounties when they refused to let women ride in the boats that braved the rapids on the way to Whitehorse. Now, another side of this, the sex working industry is, the prostitution that was there. So, like I said, about half of the women in Dawson City worked within the red light district. Now, this is obviously a very dangerous thing to do at the time. It put one made one very vulnerable, but it also offered economic opportunities one couldn't necessarily find elsewhere. One way to get out of that was to marry. However, a lot of these women, when they viewed marriage, it was viewed as an economic proposition. And so for them, it economically made more sense to stay unmarried and rather than just have one person that they were getting wages from get wages from a lot of men. Now, Rose Arnold and Ruth Brown are a great example of a couple Black women who chose to live this life. And it was made possible because of the a specific regiment, the Company L of the 24th Infantry, which was one of only 4 all-Black units in the United States Army. There were 112 men made up in Company L, positioned in. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
You can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yep, I think my headphones might have officially died. Okay, I'm gonna just share that again. Oops. Now, the 24th Regiment or Infantry was positioned in Skagway, which, again, made up of 112 Black men. Now, they had a very clear impact on Skagway society. Their presence and work there helped to spread tolerance. And by becoming residents there, they also opened up the door for many other African Americans looking to come north. They blazed the trail for an African American workforce in Skagway. And the town was able to host African American barbershop owners, housemaids, and sex workers like Rose Arnold and Ruth Brown. Now, in particular, these women saw the opportunity for success when those people came in because often the white sex workers would refuse the service Black soldiers. And so these women had an unprecedented opportunity to make money and establish themselves later in life this way. I know I'm getting down on my time here, and so, just to sum up some of the journeys of different women that we've gone through, and thank you all for going on that journey with me. Women history is Alaskan history, and Alaskan history is women history. It's impossible to separate the two. Women have been a part of Alaskan history as long as there's been people in Alaska, which is, as we know, is thousands and thousands of years. And just looking at this one microcosm of just a couple years of time, where we had women coming up, in smaller numbers than men, but still braving the same tough environmental conditions, escaping the constraints of society at the time, and they were able to forge out new identities that women hadn't been able to elsewhere. We've seen how women could be miners and make successful or have success that way. We've seen how women could be business owners, and Black business owners at that. We saw how women could be dance hall girls, and make a name for themselves, and how, the sex working industry offered opportunities, economic opportunities that hadn't been seen elsewhere, and shaped the way that these towns thrived. One thing that I, find a lot of inspiration from about these women is the sense of pioneering and forging out an opportunity for oneself in an environment that is harsh and dangerous, and yet still finding the inspiration, the spirit to forge on despite those obstacles, to really try to find what it is that makes you you, and become the best identity that you can, whether that's economically, or just for the pure seeking for adventure. Now, one last thing I'm excited about too, all these cool women make me think of, it makes me think of how even just in my own role today in natural habitat, there are so many amazing women leaders in our field. So within Alaska, I just wanted to give a shout out to a few different leaders we have within Alaska. Annie, who's the Guide Development Director based out of Homer. We have Mackenzie Daigle, who newly promoted to the Field Operations Coordinator for Alaskan Adventures. Stacy Dixon, who's the Adventure Director of all Alaskan Adventures. Laura, who's the lead guide up in Alaska, and Caprice, who is the just absolute manager of Bear Camp. And these women inspire me today. These are some amazing modern women of Alaska that inspire me, just like those women of the past inspire me as well. And again, I thank you all for listening to these stories of these women and taking a little travel through a couple years of history with me. And I'd love to open up towards any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. There are a couple questions, but I just want to remind everybody that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. So you listed um, required provisions to go to the gold fields. Do you know if there was somebody enforcing this, or was this more of just a suggestion if people wanted to survive?
Yeah, no, so it was required. So there was a station Mounties, and they actually weren't called Mounties at that time. That's just our familiar word for it. But that was it was the commissioned by the Canadian government, people that were there to help the miners by preventing them from going if they were unprepared. You can imagine, the trials of a Yukon winter, and what it would be like to try to go there if you came without potatoes or 150 pounds of bacon. You can't eat gold. You might have found all the gold in the world, but you can't eat gold, is what people found again and again. And so it was required that you pass with all of that counting of those supplies. Now, the supplies for women, those were not necessarily required in certain senses. I mean, women, again, it was illegal to go on the trail if you were wearing pants by the Mounties, and so you would be required to bring some of those extra things for women on that list. But just based on the constraints of society at the time, those were heavily recommended. All of the extra garments that women were more suggested, but kind of required to bring along as well. But yeah, no, I have heard of a couple attempts for folks to try to do the historical walk, meaning you hike the Chilkoot with lugging, you bring 50 pounds and drop it at the base of the Golden Staircase and hike back. You get another 50 pounds, you do that again and again and again, for hundreds and hundreds of miles it makes up. And I do not envy the people who did that in the past. I will stick to my my REI boots and my Patagonia shorts next time I do it. Because luckily, when we do cross over now, you do go through a Canadian border, and you do have to sign in, but they do not count your goods to make sure you have 2,000 pounds.
I just can't imagine. I cannot imagine. I lived for a summer up in McCarthy, Alaska, at the base of the Kennecott Glacier and the Kennecott mine there, and was fascinated with the mining history and the women's role up there. And I can't imagine having to live up there with that under those kinds of circumstances, especially in those kinds of with that kind of gear. It's quite amazing to imagine. We'll
Yes,
give
yeah,
we'll
definitely.
we'll give folks another minute to see if we have any other questions coming in. But that appears to be the only questions. You did a great job of sharing all that history with us. Is there anything else you want to share about your experience up in Skagway?
I'll say just experience as far as like being a woman up in Alaska, and in a woman guide specifically. It's still is often considered to be a male-dominated industry when it comes to different leadership positions, the outdoor industry, and a lot of industries in Alaska as well. It's the state that has the highest disparity between population of men versus women. I think right now it's at about 105 to 107 men per 100 women. Which, I mean, the joke is that, if you're a straight woman looking for a date, that the odds are good, but the goods are odd. So that's the local joke up there. But I'll say that I have just been really in love with my experience since joining Natural Habitat Adventures, and just how much they do focus on female leadership, especially up in Alaska, a land that, traditionally men have been highlighted. Alaska is one of those places where women get to be the main character of the story instead of being sidelined by history. And so it's really cool to see Natural Habitat making history in that way, particularly with these amazing women that I'm putting up on the screen now again, and having them be my mentors, my leaders, my bosses, is a pretty inspiring thing within a state that, has historically, not highlighted those amazing women that I just went over.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting the amazing women up there, and also the fabulous new women-only itineraries. Can you say a little bit about those itineraries, or what makes them different or special? Like, what happens when you get a group of women together and it's just women? Any magic that you can share?
I think that there's, with any trip, there's such magic in bringing people from diverse backgrounds together, male or female, because you see friendships spark. I'll say with when it's women in particular, or women identifying people that are coming together and sharing an adventure and experiencing something new together, there is a sense of magic to it. It's often relationships forge so quickly when you have women with a common goal in an area. It's also really inspiring to hear about the different life stories that led women to be the world travelers that they are today. It can be intimidating for anyone to go to a new place, to travel, to seek out adventures. And that's one of the reasons why going with an organization like Natural Habitat Adventures helps to ease a little bit of the burden of that intimidation of the planning of not knowing exactly what to do. But when you have so many women who that is their main priority of life, is to adventure and seek out new things, you hear some just really, really incredible life stories. So I know that's one of my favorite things about my work is I'm constantly inspired by the people that I'm meeting and learning from, my guests on these trips. When you have a bunch of women come together, it's I'll say that there's just definitely an element of magic to the journey when we're all there and able to share our stories collectively together.
I love it. That's been my experience as well. I led female dominated or women only trips for about 15 years, and it was magical. Especially, I mean, women just can bond so quickly, so deeply, but you get them out in the middle of nowhere, and I feel like the bonding happens, the magic is amplified. So I'm glad to hear that's happening on these trips as well. Well, that's the last question we have for today, so I'll hand it back to you for closing comments.
I just want to thank everyone so much for coming along on this little journey with me, learning about some women in history that whose names deserve to be mentioned more often when we talk about history of Alaska. Again, the Klondike Gold Rush, there was good and bad things that occurred due to that. There were. I want to acknowledge that it wasn't always a good history in the impact it had on many different Native populations and the pressures that influx of people had on those groups. But it also led to economic booms for many in the United States across the country, and opportunities for women of all races and backgrounds to come and find financial independence, to make a name for themselves, to be business owners, and really just claim a piece of history for themselves. So thank you all again for letting me share a piece of that very nuanced history with you. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in Alaska in the years to come.
Thank you so much again, Samantha. That was super interesting. I also want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.